our next guest, who has just launched a new series detailing the history that goes back several decades involving the UFC and Donald Trump. It is Karin Zidan, and his first episode is out now.
This is In the Red Corner, a 3-part audio series about the UFC, Donald Trump, and the violent politics that unite them. I'm Karin Zidan. I'm an investigative reporter, and I've spent the last decade covering the intersection of sports and politics. I've uncovered stories about corruption and authoritarianism, and how some of the world's most notorious dictators use sports as a means to gain power and control. And I'm here to tell you that the relationship between Trump and the UFC is a story I've seen before. One where strong men love buddying up to strong men. On In the Red Corner, we're going to unpack the relationship between Trump and the UFC. We'll go back to the league's inception and explain how Trump gave the UFC legitimacy as politicians tried to shut it down. We'll hear how the UFC helped Trump's presidential campaigns and tapped championship fighters to help boost his allure.
So joining us now, Karin Zidan of Politika. The first episode, Do You Want to Be a Fucking Fighter? From the first season of The Ultimate Fighter, which is a speech that has been memorialized in so many different instances, comes from the fact that these fighters that were flown out to Las Vegas for this reality show were informed, you're not going to be paid for these fights. Are you crazy? And Dana White going off, how dare you? We've put so much money into this, and you have the gall to expect to be paid for your services on this show that we're going to create a franchise off of? How dare you? And how things have changed all these many decades later. Karim, welcome back to the show. It's great to hear from you.
Hi, Karim.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be back, guys. It's always great to be on the show with you. Thank you so much for having me and for offering a little preview of my upcoming series, or a series that just started, actually, In the Red Corner.
So you have covered this as extensively as anyone, but it's been so in focus in this entire election run for Donald Trump of not just like this sidebar issue of how the UFC has been ingrained in this effort by the Donald Trump campaign, but the fact that this has become a major area of persuasion and these glorified like propaganda events that have accompanied Donald Trump, complete with theme music and being adored by these sold out crowds. And it's become a staple now of a lot of these UFC pay-per-views. And here we are in 2024, and the person introducing Donald Trump at the Republican National Convention is not Melania. It's not one of his sons. It's Dana White.
It's fascinating, really, watching this history play out from the very beginning. Now, I really don't want to, I know your listeners in particular probably know the history of the UFC, etc. So I really don't want to bog them down with going that far back in time. But to really answer your question, I want to focus on just how we've seen this evolution take place just from 2016. So the time when Dana White actually stepped onto the national political stage at the RNC, the Republican National Convention in 2016. He stepped up on stage at the time, and this was the RNC that everybody thought was going to be a bit of a joke. We should have known better at the time, I think, or at least I will speak for myself and say I should have known better at the time. This was the RNC that Alex Jones was present at, where white nationalist Richard Spencer was there. But none of us took it seriously because the people speaking ahead of Trump were like the Duck Dynasty guy. It was Melania Trump up there. It had the glitz and glamour, but it was hard to take seriously. It was as if you're entering this new absurd age of Republican politics. And that was really personified by Dana White, who comes up on stage and says, I'm sure you're all wondering why the hell this fight promoter is here. But he goes on this big speech explaining how Donald Trump was there for the UFC in its darkest days, helped them host events at his Trump Taj Mahal. And due to that, the UFC now stands loyal with Trump. And Dana White ends the speech with a quote that I think continues to stand the test of time, which is that Donald Trump is a fighter, and I know he's going to fight for this country. This symbolism has since continued to sort of propagate throughout Donald Trump's campaigns and his presidency as well. This idea that he is utilizing things like mixed martial arts, combat sports, and these powerful figures, fight promoters like Dana White and these other fighters as well, to present himself as a strong man. That's at the end of the day what this is all about. Envisioning republicanism and conservatism and this new hyper masculine identity. And that's something that Trump really managed to embrace by using the UFC. And things only got more significant from there. If that RNC was anything, it sort of laid bare and foreshadowed what was going to happen moving forward. So almost immediately, Dana White starts promoting Donald Trump's policies. He was even defending things like Donald Trump wanting to build a wall, at the border with Mexico. He went to tons of Trump rallies. He was with him on Air Force One multiple times. This is one of my favorite parts. The UFC even did a documentary
Oh yeah.
promoting Donald Trump, calling it Combatant in Chief. I don't know if you guys ever got to see that
Oh, I
documentary.
saw it.
Mind you,
Yes.
yeah, it's not even really available anymore to find, but it was 14-minute case study in just how an organization like the UFC can sports wash Donald Trump's reputation. It's fascinating stuff, really. And it was this sort of approval from the executives and the higher ups of the UFC that sort of encouraged and emboldened UFC fighters to start taking a stand for Donald Trump as well. We started seeing things like Colby Covington, who became the personification of MAGA just in his presence, with the MAGA hats and all the ridiculous quotes he had. You had people like Tito Ortiz, Henry Cejudo, all these former champions all promoting Donald Trump. You just had Henry Cejudo just recently holding a rally in Michigan to try and get Arab American voters to come out in favor of Donald Trump. Like, we're still seeing this happen right now. But the difference is, and the reason why we came to do this new series, this ongoing series that we have in the Red Corner. It's done by myself and Ellie Blyer, who's a good friend of mine. He's the podcast producer for this. He actually approached me with this, saying, hey, the stakes are actually quite significant here. What we're seeing now is not just this relationship, but we're seeing it evolve, and we're watching the UFC actually normalize Donald Trump at this very intense period. I mean, Donald Trump, when he's been appearing at the UFC now since he's had how many, I don't know how many, over 30 felony convictions, right? After helping encourage the January 6th insurrection. All of these things have not in any way his sexual misconduct. None of that has stopped the UFC from embracing him. As a matter of fact, every time he steps into a UFC arena, it continues to normalize Donald Trump.
Do you have thoughts, Karim, about why UFC fans, because he's received positively, right? He's cheered. I don't know if you brought out Donald Trump in other contexts in sports and entertainment, if he would be so roundly cheered. And like I'm somebody who's not watching UFC regularly. I used to watch it more so in the mid 2000s and times like that, where I don't remember it being so political or politicized. Like, why does Donald Trump and his politics, why does that gel so well with this audience?
We're in an interesting moment, I think. We have seen just in the past 10 years a significant cultural shift, at least happening in the United States. And honestly, I can speak internationally as well for the most part, because I've witnessed it even in my home country of Egypt. We're seeing, first of all, and this is like a highly discussed topic now, which is this gender divide in this upcoming election. The fact that apparently, according to polls, young women in particular, are leaning more progressive, while young men are leaning conservative. The truth is that it's becoming cool again to be conservative. The idea that young men are growing up to be progressive and to be feminists, etc., it's not as attractive as it once was. And the UFC seems to have noticed this. And whether it be, during the time of Trump or right before it, they were aware that this cultural shift was about to take place, and they were happy to embrace it. And I think in terms of what the UFC did, it worked out in their favor. The UFC has always had a significant demographic of young men. Many of those men we could call them apolitical. We'd say they're not even interested in politics, but a significant amount could be swayed towards conservatism or to the right wing. And that's what the UFC really took advantage of here. So, given mixed martial arts' history, this history of the sport being a niche sport where it was an us versus them mentality from the very beginning, even the sports foundation as an online space, as a space where people get together in forums and have discussions. And unfortunately, these forums also happen to be the place where people started getting radicalized and being led down the path of far right conspiracy theories. There is a significant correlation between how just the shift towards conservatism that we've seen and how young men have been a significant part of that. And they really present themselves outwardly in certain sports. And I don't think any of them have been more significant than the UFC.
Do you find, Kareem, following this as long as you have, that there's somewhat of a pattern where you can look at one of the key ways that Donald Trump has been able to communicate with these young male voters is presenting them as disenfranchised and being under attack, and I am the candidate standing for you. And it's not all that dissimilar to a generation ago when I think a lot of MMA fans felt the same way. Like, this sport could go away at the hands of politicians and was under attack. And now here is the person going for the highest office in the world, and he's one of our guys. And I think you have seen that bleed over to an effect that he is speaking to an audience that sort of in their DNA have felt like they've been on the outskirts of mainstream culture, and now they're being embraced by the person that is at the forefront of it.
That's an excellent point, John, and that's something I really saw very clearly last year when the UFC hosted Donald Trump for a UFC Unfiltered podcast, actually. So he appeared on this podcast with Matt Serra, and they spent the hour actually talking about boxing. It was apparently recorded right before his appearance at one of the UFC events. I can't remember specifically which one, but they spent most of the discussion just talking about Donald Trump's history in the world of boxing, his love of Mike Tyson, his favorite fighters, his experiences as a promoter back in the day. You look at those YouTube comments. First of all, Matt Serra even in is like, I cannot believe I'm speaking to a former president who's this knowledgeable about fighting. And that's exactly what the comment section said. It said, think what you want about Donald Trump. The fact that he can sit and have a conversation like this is something I can't imagine doing with any other politicians. It's a way for him to resonate with these audiences, make them feel like he's one of them. He's just like them. He can just sit down, have a drink, and shoot the shit. And that's what these people are looking for right now. So that's a small microcosm of this wider concept that you're talking about right now, which is, yeah, Donald Trump's one of our guys. This sport that was once niche, that made us feel small, and that it was us against the mainstream culture. Well, now the guy who's supposed to be running the country is going to be potentially running the country again, is actually on our side. And this applies great for the UFC as well. You think of their history going from, a sport labeled as human cockfighting by a politician, mind you, and a Republican politician on top of that, and John McCain, to decades later now being the sport that's so heavily promoted by, the 45th president of the United States and potentially the 47th. It's such a significant transformation, and this has happened across all sections. You see the UFC running towards regulation, while in the meantime, this fan base has now embraced this idea that we are the sport that matters now. We stand here against not just mainstream culture, but even mainstream sports. The UFC has presented itself as an alternative to so-called woke sports like the NBA and the NFL. They literally oppose openly social justice changes or any sort of progressive values or identity. That's part of the UFC's brand now, and that's not a coincidence. That's not sudden. That's not a random change. That's a cause and effect.
And what's your thought of, like, we just looked this week at two prominent media appearances that Donald Trump has done with The Undertaker and is going to go on Joe Rogan this weekend. Like, this strategy is a very, finely tuned one, and you really can't dismiss the fact that, like, here is Donald Trump going directly to where he feels is going to move the needle in what's going to be an exceptionally close election, and is foregoing more mainstream outlets. I can't fault this strategy, but this is where we are. And here is your 2 weeks out from an election, and he's speaking to a WWE wrestler and Joe Rogan, and this is completely normal.
It's not just normal. I actually wrote an article about this yesterday for Sports Politika, which is my independent platform, and I titled it "Trump chose a wrestling podcast over 60 minutes, and it paid off." Because I really believe that that's what happened. First of all, he tells The Undertaker in this podcast. I actually sat down and listened and watched this thing, so that's what I chose to do with my day. But he at one point turns to The Undertaker and jokingly says something like, I turned down 60 minutes to do your stupid show. And there's such a And sure, he sounded like he was joking, but there's a heavier reality to this, which is that yes, Donald Trump not only rejected 60 Minutes, but accused them of, bias and fact-checking issues, and basically, claimed that this is not a real media outlet, and I have no intention of appearing there. And instead goes on a wrestling podcast where he's showered by adoration by a person who's clearly a very big fan of his and had no intention of, challenging him, questioning any of his statements, anything of the sort. At one point in this conversation, near the end, of course, The Undertaker chooses to bring up Title IX and this discussion about protecting women's integrity in sports. Of course, this is, a conservative dog whistle for saying, we don't want trans people in sports. But Donald Trump goes on this rant claiming that, Iman Khalif from the Olympic Games was actually a man competing as a woman, which is complete, utter nonsense. This is a person who was born as a woman. This isn't even a situation up for debate. It's complete, utter disinformation that they both happily just, built off each other. So this is the kind of podcast you're witnessing. A lot of people are going to listen to that. A lot of impressionable young men are just going to believe what both of them said there, right? This is exactly what Trump wants right now. He doesn't want to face any resistance. He doesn't want to be scrutinized in an interview. He doesn't want people discussing his, creeping authoritarianism. He wants to appear with famous people who are beloved, by millions of young men. And that's the thing you'll always hear about The Undertaker, isn't it? Oh, he's one of the most respected people in the WWE. Who doesn't love The Undertaker? Everybody loves The Undertaker. He's so respected. Well, that reputation plays a factor here as well. And beyond just the fact that Donald Trump is looking for these platforms that aren't going to challenge him, it's really a testament to what's changing right now, which is traditional media and their role in things like presidential elections. It would have been unheard of back in the day for a Republican nominee to miss that 60 Minutes appearance. It's a special primetime election special that they've always done historically. It's beyond, unprecedented that Trump chooses to skip this. Yet that's where we've arrived in this media landscape where Donald Trump can think of this scenario and think, why would I go on 60 Minutes when I can go on Joe Rogan, Theo Vaughn, the Nelk Boys, The Undertaker's podcast, and a bunch of UFC events? And that will work better for his base. Listen, I want to make one thing clear, which is we have no idea at the end of the day whether he's really truly going to be able to activate a base of young men that's going to just come out and vote and make the difference in the election. That's what they're gambling on. We do not know if these people will actually come out and vote in the end, or if they will actually make the difference. It's a risk, but it seems to be a smart one for Donald Trump. It's an interesting strategy, and it's funny that one of his campaign strategists was actually a former UFC communications director as well, or someone who worked in UFC PR departments. So the connections between the UFC and Trump are seemingly never ending.
Yeah, it's a great point. And it's something that I think about a lot just in doing what we do is like everyone has a platform now. Everyone is sort of a journalist, I think, has become one. If you've got like a public Twitter account or if you've got a podcast, in essence, like Pat McAfee has become a journalist and The Undertaker has become a journalist. So that you don't have to face an interview where somebody's going to ask you challenging questions. You go to and look, these people are TV stars and they've got a huge audience and they're capable of gathering millions of people. And I think this is true of social media as well, in that like sources don't need to talk to us, to reporters, when they can just tweet it out themselves to their millions of followers. We no longer have this platform that is differentiated. We no longer have like this big platform. They have, if anything, have bigger platforms.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to mention one thing here, which I agree with you, Brendan, but I would distinguish it and say these people aren't necessarily journalists, they are media personalities. And the reason I say that is because journalists are still held to, ethical standards, rigorous standards, or at least you would assume so. Theoretically, we're supposed to be.
I'm not saying they're good
standards.
Journalists.
Fair enough. But I think they happily want to play the role of a media personality without ever having to face any of the ethical concerns of a journalist. They would never want to label themselves as journalists, right, because they would never want to have to face those ethical issues, right? They don't. It's
actually a badge of honor for, like, The Undertaker even proclaiming we're not journalists, and that's viewed as a positive, where you turn that title into just rife for attack if you want to label yourself as such. We also want to have you on because we're coming off of both the recent Better Beeve fight that took place in Saudi Arabia this past weekend. PFL was just there for their Battle of the Giants pay-per-view, and WWE is going to make their biannual stop a week from Saturday for Crown Jewel. And this is always a topic that comes up, but it's just becoming more and more prevalent with the rise of Turki Al-Sheikh, who, it's funny, in just searching for him now on Google, everything is attached to just boxing now. Like, that is his core identity, is this guy that is bringing these fights to people. And it's interesting to see the response of various fan bases where, not to paintbrush everyone, but in boxing, it's like this guy is viewed as someone that he's putting the fights together that we would not get otherwise. In MMA, it feels as though it's just accepted. Like, this is another form of income, and they're going to be deeply involved. And in WWE, well, I think a large portion of the fan base kind of just accepts these shows for what they are. It is very notable when you have a Paul Levesque on TV as recently as last week, and he brings up Saudi Arabia, and there's audible boos from the crowd, and you do still get a level of resistance. Brandon and I were at WrestleMania this year, and again, when a commercial aired for the next Saudi Arabia pay-per-view, you could hear those boos in the audience, and it seems that, like, this is not an audience that has completely just divorced themselves from the ethical concerns at a time when I think many have just accepted, like, this is where combat sports is headed, and TKO is at the forefront of it.
You make a really interesting point, and I'd like to sort of follow up on that here, which is this discussion about, people still being able to criticize Saudi Arabia. That hasn't been normalized to that extent, and that's interesting because just a few days ago, actually on Monday, an open letter was published with more than 100 women's athletes, women football players, soccer players, some of the most popular soccer players in the world, signed an open letter condemning Saudi Arabia and its relationship with FIFA. So the primary governing body in the world of soccer. FIFA actually has this partnership with Saudi Arabia where Saudi's Aramco, which is its oil giant, is going to sponsor the upcoming World Cups, including the Women's World Cup. So all these women basically condemned this relationship and criticized it, primarily focusing on issues of women's rights and LGBTQ plus rights. Now, what I noticed was there was one statement that was later released by a Saudi women's rights activist. Her name is Lina Al-Hatloul. Something that really stuck with me. I'm going to paraphrase it here and say, as long as Saudi Arabia refuses to address its underlying issues of, its treatment of women, its treatment of migrant workers, just generally its wide range of human rights abuses, this will always mar its continuous development and its ambitions, no matter how much money they throw at things. And there would have been a time where I wouldn't have necessarily believed that, because I'm a cynic in many cases by nature, and just watching this overwhelming, tidal wave of Saudi investment, it makes you feel hopeless sometimes and helpless as well. So it's interesting now that we're seeing this level of pushback, and what you're talking about with these boos, that's actually so significant, and it gives me hope that this is not something that's just going to go away. That the idea that Saudi can't simply just buy its way to being normalized and to sort of buy its way into brainwashing everybody. Okay, we are no longer as repressive as we said so because we've paid this much for a boxing event. The truth is that they've made absolutely no attempts to really change the dynamics of how they operate as a government in Saudi Arabia. They've made no attempts to actually minimize human rights abuses. Their executions are on the rise, not decreasing. They're jailing more people than before. This is all still happening in Saudi Arabia. So why should we be under the impression that this country is getting better, that it's a reformed nation? What, because the WWE says so? Since when would I believe them, right? The WWE has gone a long way in normalizing Saudi Arabia to an extent. There was once upon a time where we would never have expected Saudi to have this level of investment. You look back on its early years, 2015, 2016, when they first started this Vision 2030 investment in sports thing, it was minimal. It was where they could fit in and where they were allowed to jump in. Now you've got them about to host, as in December, we're going to find out if they're going to host the 2034 World Cup. That is a huge deal and something we could not have seen coming, say, 10 years ago. A WrestleMania in Saudi Arabia, something I've said here before, is almost inevitable at this point. But the fact that fans are still vocal in their opposition to Saudi Arabia, the fact that you still have athletes willing to, sign letters condemning Saudi Arabia and demanding that FIFA, end its partnership. This is essential, and this gives me hope for us moving forward.
Do you, as we're this many years into the Vision 2030 plan, And for Saudi Arabia's side, do you feel that this, like, they have put extraordinary resources into rehabilitating its image and, you know, presenting itself on a worldwide platform, combat sports being a key vessel for that message? Has this been effective in changing that perception? And I guess what I'm getting at is there a point where they assess, like, is this the avenue we want to continue to explore, and that it's proving the dividends that we are seeking out? Like, this is not about putting on a pay-per-view that's going to do X amount of buys. Like, there is a larger goal at the what is at the end of the road here for them.
And this is a 10-year deal that expires 2027 or 2028.
Mm-hmm. Listen, in terms of individual deals, like whether they reassess their deal with the WWE or reassess very specific deals, that will depend on, I mean, the WWE used to be Saudi Arabia's biggest boon at the time, right? It was the biggest thing they were able to sign early on. But now, with it about to host, the World Cup moving forward, WWE has sort of fallen to the wayside at this point. Even in comparison to boxing, it's not their big showcase anymore, right? It's not even the feature attraction of like a Riyadh season anymore or anything like that, right? So, in terms of reassessing individual deals, that's very possible. But in terms of reassessing their commitment to sports, no. I absolutely think this is something that Saudi Arabia has already seen and has reaped benefits from. Listen, if you look at something like the public investment fund, Saudi's sovereign wealth funds, you look at the documents that they release showing how much they've invested in different sectors right around the world, whether it be health, agriculture, etc., private equity. They've invested far more money into all those different sectors than they have in sports. Yet that gets them almost no attention in comparison to just any investment they have in sports. Think of just the giga projects that they're trying to build, throughout Saudi Arabia, etc. All these investments around the world. Hell, the equity they're picking up in things like Uber and other organizations. It's not getting the attention that a few $1 million thrown here and there at sports events actually does. So to them, they're spending less on sports than they do on everything else, basically. Truly, I'm not exaggerating here. Everything else they actually spend far more on than they do on sports, and the sum that they spend on sports is already incredible. So to them, it's like, why would we stop this? We're spending pennies, relatively speaking, and gaining so much attention for it. And even the negative consequences do not in terms of criticism or occasional pushback from players and athletes, etc., is not enough to stop that.
About 6 months ago, we talked to Bradley Hope, who's the author of Blood and Oil, which is a book about the Saudi government. And he had a different view. I think we brought up in the context of sports washing, and I think paraphrasing him, he said it's a little bit unfair that when people say sports washing, it's hurtful. It's not really what the Saudi government is doing. He said it's kind of a critical view from a Western audience to think that that's the reason that they're doing things like these sports events. So, I mean, like, what do you think of that view? And is that right? Is there some way that that's right?
I think I need to see the whole quote to understand. Based on just what you've given me here, I would say it's entirely incorrect. And if anything, it's a bit willfully ignorant. But again, I don't know the whole context of what he said, but I'll explain what I mean by that. Listen, of course, I personally don't use the term sports washing much anymore because I think it's a very limited term. I don't think sports washing refers to reputation laundering. And that may be one element of what Saudi Arabia is doing, but it expands far beyond that now. But to suggest that sports in Saudi Arabia is something that's just about, improving the economy or improving the health of the people participating in sports in Saudi Arabia, I'll say that, sure, that might be a component, but that's not it either. It's soft power projection at the end of the day. It's an increase in influence, global narrative control, and soft power. It's always been about that. Everything, and this is not limited to Saudi Arabia. We can say this, that we're viewing this from Western criticism, etc. Well, first of all, I'm not Western, I'm Egyptian. I've lived in Saudi Arabia. I understand how these countries operate. And to me, you cannot ignore soft power in any country, in any context, when we're talking about foreign policy and we're talking about diplomacy in general. And this is what Saudi Arabia is doing when it utilizes sports, right? When you're hosting major events, how is that major event, how is hosting a WWE event improving the health of your population? How does it promote, going to the gym? Wouldn't improving that be building more gyms and more facilities and bringing in trainers and all that stuff? That's not what Saudi's investing in. They're investing in the spectacle
Sporting
over
and
the actual sport. You know what I mean? So it's about the spectacle for them. And if it's about the spectacle, if it's about these major attractions and attention, if it's about sponsorships, because they're spending far more on sponsorship than, say, developing, infrastructure domestically. And even the infrastructure they are developing domestically is in the lead up to massive events like the upcoming World Cup in 2034, right? They're going to build massive new stadiums for that. That doesn't seem to me like actions taken solely for the benefit of a population. If anything, I would say that if the government is thinking about the population, it's thinking about bread and circuses. It's thinking about ways to tame and distract the population, rather than actually thinking for their, the greater good here. How can we make them healthier people long term, a society that's going to live longer and happier? Don't think that's in Saudi's major interests.
I'll try to play the quote that I'm referring to here, if you can hear this.
Maybe not.
I can't hear it.
You can't hear it.
Term in Saudi Arabia here, because it has nothing to do with the way that they think about it. What they're thinking about is a few different things, right? They're trying to make their own population happy, make Saudi Arabia a place to stay, not to leave all the time. Every time you want to enjoy something, you don't want your population leaving the country to go next door to Dubai or somewhere else,
right?
Or to Europe or to America. So that's an element of it. The other element is that part of this economic transformation of Saudi Arabia, tourism actually plays an important role. So MBS genuinely wants Saudi Arabia to be a tourist destination, and that means making it entertaining. So they're building hotels, they're building event spaces. Of course, you want to have reasons to attend, Formula One races and boxing matches and things like that, So the country is transforming rapidly. It's so rapid that if you go visit Saudi Arabia 1 month and you come back again 6 months later, it feels different already, So it's undergoing a huge transformation. Now, of course, MBS has always been very concerned with the image of Saudi Arabia as a conservative, repressive, negative place, and has been working very hard to change that. And so part of changing that is to prove it's not like what it used to be. So yeah, you can call that like a sort of a PR event to prove that Saudi Arabia is different. But in Saudi Arabia, there's nobody there being like, let's open up the cash reserves for sports washing. They're thinking, we love sports. Our population loves sports. Tourists love sports. So I think it's a little bit unfair to say that it's really just for this purpose, and it really comes from the point of view of a kind of critical Western audience to think that that's the reason they're doing this kind of stuff, and that's just not how it works over there or anywhere, to be honest.
So they get the idea there.
Oh, I absolutely get the idea. And then parts of what he's saying I agree with, especially the tourism, for instance. Tourism plays a big part in this, same as it does for the United Arab Emirates, where now they've just built the biggest, artificial surf wave, and are now going to be hosting major surf events in Abu Dhabi. This is a big thing for them now. So,
and would be the goal of a Wrestlemania, would be an audience internationally coming to Saudi Arabia, experiencing Saudi Arabia, and going back and telling everyone about what an incredible trip this was.
But how can that not be considered part of soft power projection? How can that not be considered this idea that you're trying to use Saudi as a tourist destination? It's not like Egypt, which actually depends on tourism, mind you. My country depends on tourism, right? That's different. You need that tourism. Saudi doesn't need that tourism. Sure, it wants the tourism. It wants to distance itself and its dependency on oil. But this is also about changing Saudi's image, rebranding it and presenting it as a reformed nation without having to do any of the heavy lifting of actually reforming the nation. This is the key element here. Sports allows you to circumvent any of the actual hard work that has to be done. And I understand that, that there can be some sympathy towards Saudi's objectives, and we can say, oh, the West is always too harsh on this. Sure. But let's also not play under the assumption that everyone said that this was just about reputation laundering, or that this is why I really dislike the term sports washing. I really, really do, because it's such a limited term that's almost working against us now. So I don't use it. But I do, when I speak about Saudi Arabia, I speak about a multi-pronged strategy that includes tourism, soft power projection, reputation laundering, right? All of these are factors for Saudi Arabia. And by the way, yes, sports washing is mentioned. Mohammed bin Salman himself said, if sports washing raises my GDP by 1%, I will continue to use sports washing. It does not get clearer than that. So I don't think this needs, this, like, I think his argument comes from an interesting place, but I think it's misguided.
And we also had, a recent incident that got a bit of coverage, but I would imagine some people didn't even hear about this, was that before the Anthony Joshua-Daniel Dubois fight at Wembley Stadium in London, there was a journalist with The Telegraph, Oliver Brown, who showed up and had written a critical piece in the lead up to that fight and was turned away. He wrote, "In 20 years as a journalist, I've never been barred from any sporting event for any reason, let alone for simply expressing an opinion that the host did not like. But on Saturday night at Wembley, with the stadium bathed in a garish green light to reflect the Saudi flag and the Saudi national anthem given precedence over God Save the Queen in genuflection to the money men, I found myself marooned at the entrance, told my credential for Anthony Joshua's world title fight against Daniel Dubois had been revoked. The transgression to have called out this exercise in reputation laundering for exactly what it was." And I do not think this is going to be an isolated case in the combat sports field when it comes to people that want to take this critical view. And this was, now there has been pushback to this and, support for Oliver Brown, but not everyone is necessarily going to have the backing of a major paper like The Telegraph. And there is the implied message, if you are a journalist, of this is what you're facing if you want to be critical. And there's going to be many people who are going to avoid this elephant in the room, knowing that a credential might be at stake.
Yeah, well, that's what just happened there. This is, again, Saudi is now showing that it can control the global narratives and even control narratives about the events it's hosting by simply just barring journalists from participating. And that sends the message that, you don't toe the line, you're not going to be welcome here. And unfortunately, speaking for the industry as I've known it over the past 10 years and the people I've been around, that's pretty much enough to scare off most of the journalists in the space. In all honesty, there aren't that many people who come into this space hoping to be major investigative reporters or really want to approach it from that kind of combative angle. So it's difficult to look at this and not think that Saudi's just found another way to impose itself and to impose its narrative perception on different audiences around the world. And to think that the United Kingdom has reached this point where it can be controlled from a distance by Saudi Arabia speaks volumes. But this is not something limited to sports, especially in the UK. We're seeing Saudi actually and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain actually buy up plenty of the United Kingdom. It's happening in the US too, but since we're talking about the UK there are, newspapers being bought up. Selfridges was just, partially bought by the major department store was just bought by Saudi Arabia. They have a share in Heathrow Airport. Like slowly they're buying up the whole country. And the UK is more than happy to place itself in this situation. Well, let's say not more than happy. They're accepting of the situation, but this is what happens when economies collapse. And the US and the UK is in a situation where it needs help from these countries that have major resources. So even in the position of global leverage, Saudi Arabia has plenty of leverage over these other countries right now. So any of these incidents that happen in sports is not going to be enough to stop UK politicians or to make UK politicians stop this at all. As a matter of fact, think back to when Boris Johnson was prime minister. The Athletic published this piece with leaked emails and stuff showing that Boris Johnson was actually leaning on the Premier League and Newcastle to complete its deal, this Newcastle United English football team, to complete its deal with Saudi Arabia. They actually wanted the Saudi government to take over this football club because they thought it would help with diplomacy at the time, and the UK really needed Saudi Arabia's money. So this is the situation we're in right now. Saudi Arabia is playing its cards according to what it sees the world is right now, and they're winning.
Karim, it's always fascinating to chat with you. We could talk about this for many hours. I do encourage everyone to go check out your new series. Episode 1 is out now, and can you give us a tease of what's to come? It's going to be a 3-part series. What is coming forward, and where can people go listen?
So episode 2 is actually coming out on Thursday. So you'll have it Thursday morning on your favorite podcast app. So it's everywhere. It's on Apple, Spotify, etc. If you want to listen to it on the embed on sportspolitika.news, you can go there. And if you enjoy the work, by all means, join and become a subscriber. We'd love to have you. We're building the community right now. To give you a little teaser, episode 2 is going to focus on the time between 2016 and 2021, sort of the Trump first campaign his presidency and the fallout to that presidency. Everything the UFC did to be involved in that, the rise of personalities such as Colby Covington, everything leading up to about the time of the January 6th insurrection. So it's an interesting, very heavy and filled episode. It's about twice as long as the first episode too. So there's a lot of content there, and I hope you all enjoy it.
All right. Well, I certainly recommend all of Karim's great work. You can follow him at Zidan Sports and do support him at Sports Politika, doing a lot of great journalism out there that is very necessary, especially in this current climate and culture. And it's always great to catch up with you, Karim. All the best.